Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
And I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to do something interesting. I'm going to preface this a little bit. At the beginning of 2020, we came up with a concept that we were going to try to run throughout the year called 20 for 2020. We kind of stole the framing of that. But the basic idea would be, since our listenership has increased pretty well in 2020, we would start to do a little bit of content that would be getting to know us, getting to know our tastes. The other side of that is we're going to mention stuff that we haven't done shows on. And if we mention it, we obviously want to talk about it. So let us know if you want a show on one of these movies that we're going to talk about. We're going to try to do a couple more of these. Probably not as expansive as we originally thought, as, you know, the entire world changed as we were thinking about doing this.
Right now we're doing top 20 movies, but in the future I might do like shows, albums, things like that.
Yeah, and you guys can even let us know what you'd be most interested in. I think it'd be fun to do albums, just because it's a different take on storytelling. You know, with our recent interviews, we've been trying to go in different directions with all different types of storytelling. Music is certainly something we can delve into. But, you know, Christian and I were talking before the show of how to do this. We think the best way to do it is kind of do it in chunks of 5 and briefly talk about it as we name those 5 movies and then discuss a little bit. And we want to make this clear. One of the things that we don't do and haven't done, and it's very, very intentional, is create like best of lists, create lists that we think are like definitive, because neither Christian nor I believe that 2 people could put together a list of movies that would say best. So these are our favorite movies. We're not saying they're the best movies ever made. We're saying that they're our favorites, and you can come at us and criticize it. That'll be a lot more fun. But I don't want anyone to think that I'm necessarily trying to definitively say that anything is better than anything else. It's just how much I like it.
Because my list is going to be very weird, and some of these movies probably shouldn't be in anybody's top 20 list.
But with that caveat, we're going to begin to rattle off these movies and then talk about them a little bit as we go. And as we said, please, if you're listening and you want to hear more about a certain movie, you think it's a good topic for a whole show, let us know. That's part of what we're doing here. And obviously, like, they're our favorite movies. We want to talk about them. It's not, secret.
All right, so this is 20 for 15. So at number 20, I put Dawn of the Dead. I feel like this is probably one of the most essential horror movies, and I think it's also one of the most fun. I think it has one of the most impactful, like, messages, and it has probably one of the better characterizations. I know we're a bit of a horror renaissance where we're seeing more complex horror movies come out, but I really feel like a lot of their roots lie here. I put Logan at number 19. That's the Wolverine movie. I felt obligated to put an X-Men film somewhere on this list. And I think Logan's probably the best example of all the X-Men movies. And we talked about it before on our Wolverine podcast, so I won't dwell on this more. I put Amadeus at number 18. Amadeus being the movie about Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. It's not historically accurate, but I think the way it portrays like cinematography and the way it kind of portrays that area is still to this day incredibly fascinating and important. And I think it's just overall a great film. It's not stuffy like a lot of not old movies, but movies about older eras are. 17, I have WALL-E. I think WALL-E is pretty self-explanatory. I love animation, and I think I love animation that tends to break conventional storytelling. And for like half of the WALL-E runtime, it's a silent movie about robots, and I love robots. So, and they go into space, and I like space, so this is an easy choice. Number 16, I put Old Boy. This is a movie that people kind of stopped talking about, and I think that's just because of the director's follow-up films. I've kind of been fairly lackluster, to put it simply. But I think Old Boy is probably like peak mid 2000s where there's still that like edge, and it came out like slightly before The Dark Knight or around The Dark Knight, and there's that really like violent edge, and it's like a really cool revenge movie. I if you haven't seen it, definitely seen it.
Interesting. We're not really on the same page at all right now, which I think actually surprised me a little bit. So for my number 20, I went RoboCop. Probably the tightest superhero script ever written. It is not a long movie. It is super action packed. They don't treat the audience like idiots. They never get too deep into explanations. Anything like that's going to have its level of kind of stupid exposition. Like, there's nothing you can do. It's a goofy concept, but I think it's executed about as well as you can execute a superhero movie. Coming 19, I have A Nightmare on Elm Street, the original. I think the concept that changed horror. It's not quite a slasher, but it still utilizes a lot of that violence and once again creates a monster that's scary for its era. Number 18, Return of the Living Dead. Easily the funniest horror movie ever made. I can watch Return of the Living Dead 3 times in a row and still think it's funny every time. Short, to the point, fun. It's making fun of all of the more serious films, including the kind of Dawn of the Dead aesthetic, but came out of the fact that they didn't want to try to challenge Dawn of the Dead as a real sequel, so they made something very different. Number 17, The Dark Knight. Just so incredibly influential. Another one that we already did a lot of show on, and well worth it. For all of its flaws, still probably the purest superhero movie ever made. That's going to sound really weird when you have stuff like Superman out there, but The Dark Knight plays with themes incredibly well and packs in all of the comic book ridiculousness that it can. Number 16, Apocalypse Now. I think Coppola's best movie. I don't think there are many films comparable to it, especially because it's masking itself as a Vietnam film when it's really this sort of insane fantasy. And even just its origins are worth the result. With George Lucas's original concept of going and shooting in an active war zone, it somehow becomes something completely transcendent and a story that will never lose relevance.
It's funny you mentioned both the Dark Knight and Apocalypse Now. I feel like Oldboy and Dark Knight parallel each other pretty well, because even though they're both very different movies, I feel like they both kind of contain that same high octane action. Of course, Oldboy has a much smaller budget than The Dark Knight, but I feel like they kind of accidentally sit on the same plane with each other.
Yeah, I think there is, especially now that we can look at it objectively, there's certainly an aesthetic to the early 2000s. I personally was not huge on Oldboy, but I think your argument is valid that it encompasses that aesthetic, that it is very much of its time, and the action sequences are undeniably well done. Story-wise, I don't know, I just never caught it. I think your most interesting pick out of those 5 is Amadeus. Massive when it came out, also very influential when it came out, and that's something that isn't as recognized as it once was.
No, it's interesting. I still really like that movie a lot, but I just think it's because of how I guess there aren't really many historical movies anymore, and even back then it was kind of playing with that genre in of itself.
It is, and as you're saying, like, not historically accurate, but kind of taking the ideas of that era and doing like a pretty crazy story. It is a cool movie if you haven't seen it. As you're saying, Logan, we've talked about quite a bit. Dawn of the Dead, I think, is the movie that changes zombies forever. Like, Night of the Living Dead might be more influential at the end, but Dawn of the Dead is absolutely how we see zombies from that point on. And Wall-E, super, super pure Pixar, probably the purest and what they do best as far as being able to tell stories that are accessible to everyone.
Yeah, yeah. I also when he had RoboCop, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Return of the Living Dead, those are like some real like classics, like 80 classics. Hard to disagree with any of those.
Yeah, it's a little insight into how I put this list together, and here everyone can. I mean, you already know that I'm crazy, but I started out with a list of 98 movies, and
Oh
you're not shocked though. You know how I work.
no.
Um, I started out with a list of 98 movies, and what I did is I took the first 20 that I wrote down, and I put them in an order of how much I liked them, and then I would just look at 21, and if I liked it more than number 20, I would move it up one, and if I liked it more than number 19, I would move it up one, and so on and so forth until I got it down to 20. Um, so it's a very pure list, in my point of view, because I was even like kind of pushing myself not to make choices I didn't really believe in. And that was like a really good way for me to do that. And so, yeah, I think you get that little streak there of the 80s classics because they pretty much have influenced my taste going forward. I could rattle off hundreds of horror movies that I enjoy, but those ones push into territory that, is like almost sacred.
Yeah, as I didn't do anything quite as similar as that. I kind of, I guess, like try to remember which movies had the most emotional impact on me, and kind of went backwards from there.
Yeah, and I think that's as valid. Yeah, no, I did my crazy like I like to organize things way, and it worked for me. And I think yours is probably as good because you went straight emotion, which means you're going to think of what you should be thinking of immediately.
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of how I went through it.
So I'll lead off on the next five. We'll go with number 15, 1995's Empire Records. I think for the 90s, uh, for the younger side of Generation X, might be kind of the definitive cultural movie. It's hard for me to say. I'm kind of on that generation that straddles Millennial and Generation X. I never really felt like either. But Empire Records, for my friends who are a little older, was a big touchstone, and I agree. I've watched that movie countless times. I think there was literally a year of high school where I watched it every day. Not an exaggeration. Number 14, National Lampoon's Vacation, another seminal film that kind of launched a bunch of not as good copycats, little meaner than the later ones in the series. Not quite as mean as the story it's based off of, but funny from start to finish. Number 13, another comedy I have, Coming to America. Definitely my favorite of the Eddie Murphy films. I think it's another one that the impact is not quite as recognized as it once was. Sort of just a perfect little comedy script. Number 12, Man of Steel, my favorite superhero movie. I think we talked about Man of Steel for an entire episode. We don't need to get too back into it, but I think thematics wise and execution, I can't think of anything I like more. And number 11, relevant this year, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, just batshit crazy idea for a movie that somehow works and maintains heart, maintains pace, maintains comic timing. It's an absolute marvel if you really start looking at what that movie is and what it ends up being on screen.
I almost put Seventh Seal on my list, just to talk about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. All right, so here's my next five. At 15, I have Amelie. Again, like a movie from the late 90s, early 2000s that isn't as recognized anymore, but it was a kind of that important film, French, important French film. But it kind of it kind of captured that late 90s aesthetic of like I guess manic pixie dream girl if you want to be dismissive about it. But it's a lot more gentler and it's basically more of a romance from like I guess the manic pixie dream girl's perspective. Let's see. Number 14, I put Black Dynamite. Black Dynamite again also not as recognized anymore, because it was a bit of a cult hit. I know it had a TV show on Adult Swim, but it only lasted like a season or two. But Black Dynamite is a film movie that still makes me laugh, and I just love how absolutely absurd it is, and just revels in that absurdity. 13, I put a indie film called Ink. It came out in like 2009, and it was probably shot on the budget of like a hamburger, but it deals with like spirits and it deals with like grief. And to put it simply, it's about a spirit that steals a girl and basically tries to sell her to demons. But what I loved about this film is like how it shot everything and how it kind of tried to make this grand fantasy like epic off of like a budget of nothing, and it does extremely well with it. And then number 12, I put Jacob's Ladder. Jacob Ladder is kind of still subtly influential even till now. It gets referenced sometimes, especially when talking about certain works like Silent Hill and things like that, and that's kind of why I like this movie. It's a lot like Silent Hill, but in movie format, and it's a lot better than the Silent Hill movies that have come out. And I like that it kind of deals with a war movie, but like after the fact. Lastly, I put number 11, Metropolis. Metropolis, again, another like, I guess like essential movie. There's legends around this with the missing footage that is still missing to this day. It is a silent movie, but what I love about this is how visually striking it is to this day, and how they make the sets and how they like created this grand epic like way back then, and it's still just like wild and amazing to me even now, even though it's almost 100 years old at this point.
Yeah, Metropolis definitely still, especially visually, very influential. We don't really have to go into the thing you've heard a billion times about Star Wars and Metropolis. Um, I think this is an interesting chunk of films. Amelie, another one, huge in its time, and as you were saying, very much fits its era. Black Dynamite, I want to like applaud you for putting on this list. Black Dynamite, also one of the funniest movies ever made, especially if you've watched a lot of blaxploitation films. It loves what it's making fun of so much. Like the fact that there are like fourth wall breaking gags in the film, and the film's already ridiculous. Just such a great movie.
Yeah, that's what really made me like fall in love with it. Like people fucking up the script and everything, like deliberately. And then you like I watched this. I watched Black Dynamite without having watched much black exploitation. But like even then, I was able to get all the jokes. And then when I looked back in the film, and then I was like knew where the jokes were coming from, like they were basing on real movies. That just like enhanced them for me. But with Bill, we talked a lot about Man of Steel already. But like again, you have like a really like solid chunks of like classics, like bread and butter classics, like Empire Records. Rex Manning Day still gets referenced to this day, even though like I don't think you really see the influences of that film anymore. But I think it's kind of slowly making a comeback. Coming to America and National Lampoon, again, like two classics. I'm not a huge Eddie Murphy fan, but again, like I kind of grew up in the era of like Norbit and like Pluto Nash. Uh, so like so like Eddie Murphy's influence to me is like a bit less. But Bill and Ted Excellent Adventure I really like, just because I like how they're two like stoners, but they're not like mean to anybody. And like usually in 80s movie that's kind of like a not like a mean streak, but like I guess like I don't even want to call it contempt, but there's like a more willingness to make fun of people that are kind of like slightly different than them. But I like how accepting like Bill and Ted are of like every historical figure they come across, even though they have like no idea who they are. And they're
Yeah,
like, oh yeah, that's just like Napoleon's thing. He likes water slides, you know.
it's so like joyous and
Yeah.
like pure in its comedy, and like that's what amazes me is comedy is so hard to do without like like a tinge of like mean. Like it doesn't always have to be super mean, but like even like the two that preceded on the list, National Lampoon's Vacation, definitely a lot of mean jokes. Coming to America, absolutely. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure gets through a movie without ever coming off as like dismissive.
Yeah, exactly. Like usually they're making jokes at somebody, and here it's kind of just making jokes about like this weird situation that's happening. Like
Yeah, Attila the Hun's at the mall.
yeah,
Or was that
like
Genghis Khan? Did I screw that up? It's Genghis Khan, right?
Genghis Khan, yeah. Um, but like even with like we were talking about Black Diamond, like loves black exploitations. There's still that tinge of like, man, like how fucking stupid were these guys making these movies? Like how could they leave the microphone in these shots, even though they still like these movies? There's that tinge of that.
Yeah, I think I think it is. It's still more loving than anything else. It's just more, once you're able to separate what ended up being the film from the creators, like then you can start making fun of it. I feel like that's sort of what it is. Like as you said, you hadn't watched like a lot of the blaxploitation films going into Black Dynamite. If you had, it would be a slightly different experience when like the car rolls away, because stuff like that happens. Like especially the ones that aren't famous, like the lesser known ones are utterly ridiculous how like quickly they were trying to make those movies.
Yeah, like the most famous ones are usually the ones with like the boom mic and the shot and everything.
Yeah.
Like that's from Dolomite, and I love how they played it in Black Dynamite. I'll do my next five, then you can do yours. All right, so this is kind of where it gets a little weird. There's a lot of animation coming up. Like I said, I really like animation. Number 10, I put Spider Man Into the Spider Verse. Even though there's tons and tons of Spider Man movies, I feel like Into the Spider Verse kind of captures all the different Spider Mans into one really cohesive and amazing package. And it kind of captures like the essence of all the different Spider-Mans that have recently popped up and kind of like what carries through all of them. Like you think with like Spider-Gwen and even like Old Man Spider-Man and even like Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, there's not a whole lot connected to them besides the brand. But I think Into the Spider-Verse really like finds that connective tissues and really creates a wonderful story out of that and creates a visual feast. Even to this day, I love what they did with the animation, and they kind of made it look like a living comic book. And the score in it is fan fucking tastic. Number 9, I put Spirited Away. I had to put a Miyazaki movie here, and Spirited Away is my favorite. I do love all the Miyazaki movies, but I do have occasional problems with some of his movies because how he makes them storyboard first, so there's not really a plot all the time. I usually use Howl's Moving Castle as an example of that, but I think Spirited Away is the one with the most character and the most story to it. And also, I think it is visually wonderful. Number 8, I put 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think this one's fairly self-explanatory. I like space, and I think what Kubrick does with it is pretty incredible. And even way back then, it's kind of amazing how this movie didn't win an Oscar outside of special effects. But it's also understandable because there's not a whole lot of story to it. It's a whole lot of like thematic stuff going on. And number 7, I put Barry Lyndon, which is another Kubrick movie. I like Barry Lyndon a lot more than 2001. Even though I both find Kubrick, almost all of Kubrick's movies like amazing, I think Barry Lyndon is the one that sticks with me the most, just because it kind of feels like it has the one with the most like character and foresight through it, and also like historical movies too. I like how he kind of creates this time period and creates this atmosphere that's kind of absent from 2001. Like 2001's very sterile movie. And then I know you like this one, Eraserhead. I put at number 6. I know David. This is like David Lynch's first movie, and it's it is a hard movie to get through at times. But I like how this movie is just kind of like a pure emotions coming onto screen, and is kind of horrible and icky to go through. And I really like that. Yeah, that's those are my next 5.
Yeah, we'll get to Eraserhead, don't worry. I feel like my next 5 are getting into the like almost well duh territory for me, which is fine, because it's a top 10. Um, number 10 for me is Jaws. I don't want to ruin anything going forward talking about the director too much, but I think Jaws is another like near perfect film for what it's trying to accomplish. Everything about it becomes iconic as time goes on, to the extent where even talking about it sometimes feels like you're trying to like parody it. It's a very solid film that became so influential that it's a given. Like it's almost hard to talk about because everything in it works so well. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I love all three of the original Indiana Jones films. We can talk about Crystal Skull another day. But I watched Temple of Doom a lot as a kid, and the thing that I grew to appreciate about it as an adult is Raiders of the Lost Ark is a story where Indiana Jones is doing something like even beyond him. Like it's something that is, you know, the epitome of what his potential is, but it's not his everyday. The Last Crusade, very similar in that respect. And The Last Crusade also dumps on more comedy, not so much more comedy, but more deliberately funny things that come off as part of the script. And once again, not a bad script, not something I'm criticizing as being bad. Temple of Doom to me is the perfect middle ground, like the perfect Indiana Jones adventure. Not his biggest story, but something you're getting to see that's a lot of fun and doesn't go too far in any direction as being too funny. I would argue it's actually as violent as Raiders of the Lost Ark, if not as gory all the time. Number 8, Halloween. I think Halloween completely changes horror. Once again, not unlike Jaws, sort of doesn't seem like there's any way to do that story better. It ends with this sort of ambiguous ending, which then leads to like 4 or 5 of its own continuities, depending how you want to see it. But the important part is Michael Myers, for some reason, doesn't die. Number 7, Die Hard. I think the greatest pure action movie ever made. The setting at Christmas helps it connect with the audience. Bruce Willis feels like the character he's playing. The sort of wacky plot of the terrorists who aren't terrorists doesn't get old, and all of the jokes land. Number 6, Creepshow. Tales from the Crypt being incredibly important to all of horror. Creepshow is the place where I think it's shown best, even beyond the Tales from the Crypt show, which is also seminal. The segments in the first Creepshow are the most memorable, probably out of all of the anthology horror films that would follow, some of which are incredibly good. Creepshow knows exactly what it is. It knows exactly what it's doing at all times, and by the end of it, you've just had a bunch of fun.
Another solid 5. Those are hard to like. Those are like essential movies too, in very different ways. My list is a bit odder in that regard.
Yeah, it's and it's funny because even saying that now, I know there's less to discuss with Jaws and Halloween and Die Hard on that list. To even really get into them, we'd need entire episodes.
Yeah.
So let us know if you want them. It's almost not worth it to try to talk about it. The one that stuck out to me on your side, the one that really stuck out to me on your side was Barry Lyndon. I like that movie because it proves how good a director for actual performances that Kubrick can be, because it seems to be something he pulls away from a lot.
Well, outside of the one time he had somebody do 100 takes of like walking across a room. And...
Right, but sometimes he's doing that just to screw with them, right? Isn't that what we've established over the years? That like he's trying to disarm them so much that they're just like anxious while they're performing, which is a different type of performance in the way I see it.
I mean, that's using great effects in The Shining, but I don't know how useful it was on Eyes Wide Shut. But I feel like Barry Lyndon is like, it's not mired, but all of that like weird controversy around it. And I like how like technically impressive it is, because back then he was using like NASA cameras to shoot this, because he was only using like candle lights and things like that.
Yeah, it's a really cool movie for those who haven't checked it out, and would you agree that it kind of defies your expectation of what you're going to get from a Kubrick film?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's less about these like abstract themes and more about this like one character's kind of sad journey through life in like the late 17th century.
I agree pretty much with everything else you said too. I think Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is this shockingly brilliant film in so many ways, that could have easily just been unremarkable or good, and they find ways to make sure that everything that happens in it is like incredibly interesting and looks good, and all your characterizations are great. Spirited Away, I think objectively, from what I've seen, has to be Miyazaki's best film. I think I'm missing two. I haven't seen two at this point. Grave of the Fireflies and Porco Rosso I have not seen.
Yeah, but usually it's Princess Mononoke and Howl's Moving Castle. I get heard a lot as Miyazaki's best movie. Princess Mononoke I usually hear from like film critics who are trying to make like essential movies, and I think that's just because Princess Mononoke came here first, and Spirited Away came here later.
I if you were to ask me preference, I would probably say Princess Mononoke myself.
Yeah.
But I can't objectively say that it's a better movie than Spirited Away. I think Spirited Away is like structurally a much better movie. And you also brought up Eraserhead, so let me talk about this for a second here. I was given a pile of movies. I had a surgery one time, and my friend
my
Omar,
God.
who has supported the show very consistently over the years, so hello Omar, handed me a bunch of DVDs while I was recovering. I watched them, and Omar, amongst these films was like Solo, and he would just throw me some of these curveballs. But I watched Eraserhead, and I was like miserable to start. I was, in pain. I was like, I just don't even understand what's happening. So a few weeks after I had recovered, and I was like kind of back on my feet and feeling all right, I'm like, all right, let me go back and watch a couple of these movies that I watched and didn't really like while I was miserable. So like the 40-Year-Old Virgin I had watched. First time I watched it, I hated it. Second time I watched it, thought it was hilarious. I own it now. I watched Eraserhead again, and I'm like, no, I was right. This is miserable. And I understand visually, I understand the art film thing. I can't bring myself to care about that movie.
No, I understand it. Again, it's a movie that's kind of like very NYU art student. I think he made it at NYU. I like it a lot just because it just makes me feel gross watching it. And I guess I kind of understand on a certain level what he's getting at about like anxiety about becoming a father and like everything going wrong. I just kind of like that grimy, disgusting like aesthetic that just makes you feel like terrible watching it.
I mean, I liked the reference in PT to it. That was cool. Who
Well,
knows? Maybe we would have gotten more references, right, Konami?
one day. But with yours, we already talked about both Die Hard and Halloween on our holiday episodes. But I find it interesting you picked Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom because uh, that's usually the derided one outside Crystal Skull.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of it was driven by the fact that it's, to me, the other adventures of Indiana Jones, where, when we had only three movies, you really had Raiders, which, if I'm being objective and I'm trying to pick what I think is the best crafted film altogether, I would say Raiders. You have Last Crusade, which is another, like, big adventure. Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom to me is Indiana Jones 90% of the time, like what was going on and that kind of cool stuff. And I loved Short Round as a kid. Like I always loved any character who was like kind of a Robin. And Short Round felt like Indiana Jones Robin because he drove a car and knew karate. It was great. I just and I'll also be like the first to admit I also watched it a lot more as a kid. It was the one I had available, and it makes an impact. But I'd like to think that after all these years of like studying storytelling, that I'm seeing something different there too. And a lot of people don't see it, and it's as you said, out of the original three, it's the one people usually put as number three. But I would also make the argument that those three still mean a lot to people in general anyway. So I think most people don't hate it. They do still like it as a movie, just maybe not as much as the others.
I I do think it's the most dynamic one visually, because you have that like minecart sequence, you have all these little different action set pieces, and like while like you said, Raiders is more structurally sound, like looking at him fighting, just punching the Nazi on the tank, that's not as dynamic as a lot of those other action scenes that happen in Temple of Doom, where there's a lot more moving set pieces going around.
These lists have gotten pretty solid as we're going. I'll lead off for the final five, so you can upstage me with whatever yours are.
I doubt I'm going to upstage you.
Number five for me is Almost Famous. Either cut, I think, are brilliant. As a writer, you always kind of connect with writer characters, and this I thought was the most fun. That sort of skewed almost reality of it all, I think works really well, where you have real figures playing against created ones who feel incredibly real. A different kind of love story played out incredibly effectively. Really a love story amongst a group of people about, how people connect, how maybe they don't connect, and the consequences of exploiting others and how you might have to deal with that if it's something that you've ended up doing. Number four, Alien. It's not just a horror movie. It's not just a science fiction movie. It goes from early drafts of the script that are pretty straightforward to something that, without being terrifically complicated plot-wise, ends up influencing two genres, and to this day looks as good as the day it came out. Like Alien, as far as both the special effects and the shots within the sets, sort of undeniable. Number three, Blade Runner. We'll go with director's cut forward on that. I didn't see the theatrical cut until I was much older. Director's cut was actually what was on television when I was a kid, so that was Blade Runner to me from the beginning. Completely subtle, about as little exposition as you can possibly get away with in a plot that complex, and something that even as a kid I was able to get the plot, and even as a kid was like, okay, well, if they look like people, then how do we know that all these people we've been dealing with aren't replicants? And obviously, thematically, incredibly sound, philosophically, plays with all these ideas of what creation is, what life is. Number two, Jurassic Park. It's Jurassic Park. I think the reason that I'm sitting here recording a podcast and I went to school to learn how to write is probably Jurassic Park, as weird as that sounds. Coming from a generation utterly obsessed with dinosaurs, getting to see them look great on screen, special effects, the practical stuff still holds up. CG's getting a little weak as we get to 4K televisions, but all the action works. Somehow more of a horror movie every year that goes by. It just seems like, we grow more and more afraid of irresponsible use of technology, and Jurassic Park, though not as deliberate as it is in the book, conveys that fear. And number one, The Empire Strikes Back. Without The Empire Strikes Back, most of any like fantasy science fiction as it is today doesn't exist. It takes the complete controlled, almost engineered competence of the first Star Wars and then puts it in a direction that I don't think anything ever went before, and allows Star Wars to become more than just a movie, more than just a few movies, to become this huge idea that can foster many different narratives.
Wow, those are all like A+ movies. Mine's a bit odder. A lot of these I saw as a kid, and kind of helped like inspire me to get into film. Number 5, I put Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Odd choice. Disney kind of ignores it, but I think there's a lot of weird like thematic subtlety to it outside of just like, the railroad company going out of business and then, freeways coming in, things like that. There's a lot of like kind of subtle implications about discrimination and things like that that I find really cool as an adult, but as a kid, I really just enjoyed the kind of weird mixture of animated characters with live action people that still looks really good to this day. Um, Number 4, I put Lion King. Again, I saw this as a kid, and I think it really helped inspire me to like love movies. I remember watching it all the time when I was like 3 or 4 years old, and I think it also helped me like animals quite a lot. So it's just kind of been shown of my background for quite a long time. Same thing with number 3, which is The Nightmare Before Christmas. This is a movie I've kind of been into since I was a kid, and I kind of watch it every Halloween now. Yeah, I don't know. Night Before Christmas is a really interesting film that has a really cool like character structure to it. Same thing with Lion King. Like Lion King has a very odd story structure to it, and that for like a good 45 minutes, it's just kind of Simba fucking up, and he's kind of stuck in one place in Act One. He doesn't really leap into action in the plot until like maybe like 50 minutes in. Night Before Christmas is a bit different in that it almost immediately goes into that act two, and then most of it is him watching him make Christmas. Number 2, I put Pink Flamingos, which is a John Waters movie that's just all about just contempt for your audience, and I love it. He just wants to make you as uncomfortable as possible, and then it strikes a chord with certain people, and that like people that get offended by it, you laugh at them for getting offended by something so fucking stupid. And that's what I really like about this film. Besides that is unwatchable, but I think it's like a good way to like uh kind of weed the chaff and find out like whose taste I land with really well. Because Pink Flamingos is just like a shocking movie that's just all about like, yeah, it has that really weird punk aesthetic to it. It was just fuck everybody. We're just going to do a bunch of cocaine and do what we want, and I find that really cool. And then number 1 is a movie you mentioned, which is Apocalypse Now. I distinctly remember watching Apocalypse Now for the first time in my basement many years ago, and I think Apocalypse Now was the movie that made me decide I want to go to film school and I wanted to learn film and write for film, because to me Apocalypse Now was such a interesting adventure from, I don't want to say adventure, but such an interesting movie where it really goes from this like horrible situation to this like abstract dreamy nightmare, and I really like that. I know it gets some criticism now from certain people, but I think as a war movie is probably one of the best. It is the best to me, and I think there's a lot to talk about just outside the production, and I think even within the story itself, it is fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we kind of show our hands on our, the background in our formal educations here. I'm lit. I'm all about story structure, things like that. Your film and a lot of what you picked out were people playing with film as a means to convey all sorts of ideas. Like Pink Flamingos, I think is a great example of that. I think Apocalypse Now is a great example of that. My choices tend to be where I think they kind of nailed the narrative, and I'm surprised by it, and it's inspiring in that sense because that's how I always think of story. I think it's cool that your choices are that way, and I would say, you said. And you kind of pulled back from it, calling Apocalypse Now an adventure. I think Apocalypse Now is absolutely an adventure. It starts off in like a terrible situation, like war, and war played pretty realistically. And then, as you're saying, it goes into this like nightmarish scenario. I think that's part of the genius of Apocalypse Now is it's a movie where the part that you're supposed to be comfortable with, you're not comfortable with, and it just gets weirder and worse as it goes.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to use adventure, because adventure has a bit of like a positive connotation to it. Like I don't know. I would describe something like Jurassic Park like an adventure. Yeah, sure, it gets scary, but I think in the end everybody gets out fine, besides the bad guys, or even like
Right.
Empire Strikes Back. You know.
Right, but I see. I think you did hit on something there. That it's you know it's funny you use Jurassic Park as that example because in the book, like most of those characters don't survive in the book, and things have pretty much gone to shit by the end of the book. There's an implication that this is like now uncontrollable. If they had gone with that ending in the movie, then that's not terribly dissimilar than like an Apocalypse Now ending.
No, but yeah, no, that is true. I just, for me, adventure has a bit too much of a positive connotation for a film where basically everybody dies or is horribly scarred mentally.
Their venture failed. That's all.
That's a good point. With yours, you have like very like big cultural touchstones. That like are like you said, like just perfect, like front to back. Uh, Blade Runner, it depends on the cut, but you said director's cut, and I know that has a huge, infamous, terrible production history where just gets constantly fucked in editing. Uh, the one that stuck out to me the most was Almost Famous because that's a film that's kind of was so monumental in the 90s, but I feel like it kind of got swallowed up by like I guess Forrest Gump. Like Forrest Gump just accidentally gobbled up hundreds of like these weird 90s movies. And Almost Famous was kind of a casualty of that, even though it is referenced to this day. I think Almost Famous is far superior. It's probably one of the best movies of the 90s. I know Jurassic Park is like, what, 92 or something?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because Almost Famous actually comes out in 2000, but like obviously 2000 compared to being in the 90s is like almost irrelevant. And that might be part of where it's lost. It's I think anyone who's seen it is like hugely impacted by it. It just so well played out. But I think you're right. It's a period piece released during pretty big cultural changes from the late 90s to the early 2000s. And I think that's maybe where it's lost some audience over the years where it shouldn't have. And Forrest Gump is funny because that's one that definitely could have made either one of our lists and didn't. Forrest Gump is another movie that's just like bizarre and somehow pulls it off. Um, but I think you're onto something there where there's some kind of little bit of lack of strength in the timing of when Almost Famous came out compared to the aesthetic it's playing. But I don't think for anyone who's seen the film that it affects it. I think it's harder to put in a box because of where it fell.
No, it's a movie that I think even persists despite when it came out, which again was like you said 2000, because people who have seen it often like put it really high and like if they make a top 100 movies list or something. And I think that speaks to the strength of the film, and even though it's not as referenced much anymore, I'm surprised you didn't pick Aliens going by your other movies, but I guess Alien is a bit more of a touchstone in that regard. I would have thought you picked Aliens, just go by your other movies, which are a bit more action packed.
Yeah, Aliens was on the longer list. I on that one I can't say how far into the process it made it. There's just something different about Alien in the feel, and I love Aliens for many reasons, but not more than the 20 that I picked. And that's just sort of where it came down to. Like it wouldn't be something I wouldn't engage on, and it wouldn't be something that if we sat here and we're doing 100 of our favorite movies, Aliens would be on there somewhere. I couldn't say for sure where, considering I started with 98 anyway, but it's, movies for both of us are a big part of our lives, both recreationally and with what we're trying to accomplish, artistically. So there are lots and lots of movies here that like could have easily made that top 20 had one of these other movies not existed. And it's as weird as that sounds. I think I picked Alien over Aliens just out of the fact that Alien comes out of kind of nothing outside of just the general idea of science fiction, where Aliens is Cameron masterfully looking at Alien and going like, okay, I can't do that again. Where can this go that will work as a new idea and be super interesting?
I think that's a good point because Aliens does have a bit more of that Cameron flair to it than Alien, which feels a bit more just able to stand on its own.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that um, when you look at our lists, there's very, very few sequels. Um, and I don't think that's really a negative thing on sequels themselves. I think it's just a comment that usually if you're going to fully form an idea and present it, that's going to be like your first shot at it. I mean, just looking at the list here, we can pick out sequels, that were mentioned. Dawn of the Dead, of course, a sequel, but Dawn of the Dead doesn't have to be watched as a sequel either. Like Dawn of the Dead, you can start with without seeing Night of the Living Dead. It's not super important to have seen the previous film. The two that you probably do need to have some background on would be Logan and The Dark Knight, because they really build off of the themes from the previous films. Logan in a way that's still somewhat unprecedented, where it's taking almost loose versions of the movies as the prequels, and you kind of put together in your head what you think happened. The Dark Knight gives you the premise, and now you get to hit the ground running. Return of the Living Dead is also technically a sequel, but it's a parody, so it's just like a perfect parody. But I think they're minimal for a reason. I think if you're going to form a kind of more perfect vision, like incredibly influential vision in some of these films, you're working to make a film. And another thing worth mentioning here, I guess, is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, kind of a sequel, but only in the sense that you kind of have to know who Spider-Man is.
Yeah, I think having seen the other Spider-Mans helps, but you don't have to have seen the other Spider-Mans. My only annoyance with that film is what they did to Penny Parker. I will never forgive them for that, because they made her more Speed Racer than Neon Genesis Evangelion, which she was in the comics. I'd also argue kind of somewhat, half serious, half jokingly, that Who Framed Roger Rabbit is a sequel to Chinatown, because it basically is just Chinatown.
It's fair. Uh, yeah, and I like that influence of like animation in your picks. It's I grew up in a lot of animation too. I don't know why it's never had the impact on me that even I feel like it should have. It's you look at my movie collection, like animation combined with my fiance's collection is one shelf, and that's weird considering when I grew up. But I don't know. It's just maybe because I don't think that way visually is the only thing I can think of. But that seems weird too because like I'm obsessed with comic books, so obviously I like illustration.
I think for me, I always liked animation because I always felt it was something where you can make the camera do whatever you want and you can put whatever you want into the scene. There's no limitation. But I wouldn't disagree with the fact that live action has a certain feel to it that animation has difficulty replicating. And I also think it has to do with the animation industry in general in America, in the sense that like Disney has such a stranglehold over it that going into animation, it's often like saying you're a Disney fan or something. So like if you're having shelf an animation, it's likely mostly like Disney stuff. And now, Disney is so accessible that I don't think it's really necessary to buy an animation, Blu-rays or DVDs or whatever.
Yeah, but I'm just like obsessed with actually owning it because it bothers me if I feel like it could go away.
No, I'm the same way.
Collector mentality. Uh, but yeah, it's. I think this was, you know, I hope this was interesting to the audience because I think it was really interesting to me to see where the differences, really lie. I think this is a good way to kind of show that between our tastes because we do agree frequently enough, and we do often like a lot of the same things, but we can see where like the real influence is on our tastes when we do stuff like this.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I agree. Like mine feels pretty scattershot looking back at it, but I just kind of picked whatever made I guess had the most emotional impact on me, or visual impact. Like what I remember the most visually.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like I could almost say the same thing with my picks, but my focus is always going to be that narrative and what it does for me and how much it's stuck in my head. And that's the list I gave was the things that I think about all the time, without necessarily concentrating on it.
Like every movie you put on here is like something we could do an episode on, just because of like their cultural importance and what they did for like the industry going on afterwards. After that, they're all like very, and even like the production history of them, they're all very important films, and that influenced like hundreds and millions of other films preceding them.
And I would say that your list, if some of the movies on here aren't as influential as some of the ones on my side, I think any of them are interesting enough to talk about at length. There's not a weak movie on here. Even, like, taste is taste. I don't like Eraserhead, but I can't turn around and act like there's not a lot to discuss about the film. I think all 40 of these films, well, nearly 40, there's a little crossover, have depth. And I think that's what's important. I love action movies. I think that kind of comes out in this list too. But I'm not putting Raw Deal on here. Like, I love Raw Deal. I'd watch that movie like a million times, but it's not on the list because it doesn't have the type of depth that even RoboCop has.
No, I'd agree. The movies you picked are deceptively deep.
That'd be a good T-shirt too. We should get on this T-shirt thing. Make it deceptively deep. But look, if you guys enjoyed this episode, please let us know. We think we're going to kind of let that dictate if we do another one. We're almost definitely going to do some more lists. If it doesn't, catch as an episode and you guys don't really like it, we'll probably do them on the site, which might be a little different too, and might draw your attention in a different way. But do let us know if there's anything on here that we talked about that we haven't covered and you want us to talk about at length. Absolutely let us know. We enjoy all of these films. Comment, like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. There's plenty of ways to talk to us. You can even message us on Facebook. We do respond. It could be either of us. It's usually me because I'm on Facebook posting stuff most of the time. But Christian is gonna start doing that now that he remembered he can, right?
Yeah, because I mostly migrated off of Facebook, but I'm probably gonna go back now. I was mostly on Twitter.
But do reach out. Let us know what you're thinking. As always, support your local businesses in this 2020 environment. That's incredibly important. If you're looking for toys, statues, even a bunch of comic book stores on there, check out toystoreguide.com. Great stuff all around on there. If you want to follow us on social media, we're pretty much Dissecting Fiction everywhere. I think on Twitter we're at Dissect Fiction, but put it into Google. If you put Dissecting Fiction Twitter into Google, you'll find our Twitter. It doesn't even matter. Google's really good with us right now. But thank you for listening to this somewhat self-indulgent episode, but we're hoping that it sparks some conversation. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And enjoy your the rest of 2020. I don't even know. Should we? We can't say anything about 2020. Enjoy this list that we made in 2020. We'll see you next time.